As you've seen in some of the margins of our text, the author has arranged for us to do certain web activities online to help us relate to the material that we're reading in the book. One of the more interesting web activities is 5.3. I'm going to walk us through that activity, but I want to highlight for you why I think it's interesting here at the outset. First, it's not interesting because it's especially well done. I actually have redone this activity and will show you my version in a second. But this activity helps us to put ourselves in the mind of a child to understand where they might be coming from when they're trying to learn a new word. So they say here, imagine that you're learning new words in a made-up language. Your task is to guess the meaning of a word based on its use with one example referent. So one example referent means we only see one icon, one object referred to by that name. So example number 1 is you see this thing and your parent says, "This is a Zav." Now you have to make a decision based on that in future contexts. You have to use this new word, Zav, to refer to something else. As an infant, what do you use that word to refer to? The next time you see an object like this, do you use the word Zav? What about if you see this? What about if you see this? When can you use the word Zav? Is it appropriate in the first, second, third contexts? Just the first two? Just the first one? Take a moment, think about it. What would you say? A second example is, this is a Schiff. Well, given what you've seen, what does a Schiff mean? If the next time you see something that looks like this, should you call it a Schiff? What if you see something like this? What if you see this? Okay, the third example is, this is a Backup. The next time you see something, could you use the word Backup to refer to this? What about, could you refer to this as a Backup? Is this a Backup? What's a Backup? Now there's an explanation given down here at the end. If you think that Zav can refer to only a Dalmatian, Schiff only to a daisy, and Backup only to a cowboy hat, then you show a tendency to limit new words to members of the same subordinate level category. Remember from my lecture that the subordinate level category is the type of thinking that an infant undergoes. So if that's the kind of thinking you engaged in, then you were engaging in infant-like learning of new words. But if you think that Zav can refer to all dogs, Schiff to all flowers, and Backup to all types of hats, then you show a basic level bias for interpreting new words. This, as you know from the lecture, is the most common level of understanding for adults of any language. So it would not surprise me at all if you engaged in this basic level bias. You probably saw a Backup, and you wouldn't surprise me at all if you thought this and this are Backups, but this is not. Now, the final explanation here says, if you think that the novel words can refer to any of the images shown, then you show a liberal tendency to extend new words to their superordinate level categories, which would be very unusual word learning strategy. So, understand, very few people, very few infants use this word learning strategy. Mostly we don't overextend. So that's a very that would be a very it's not to say that it's impossible, because there is, for instance, a word that could refer to all these things, and it's clothes or clothing. You could refer to all of these things as wildlife or plants. You could refer to all of these things as mammals or animals. And yet, if you're learning a new word, it would be difficult, just based on one hearing of that word, to assume that it's likely going to be applied to that broad category of all the different kinds of things that might be used in vaguely similar ways. Now, I'm not saying that that couldn't be the case, that a word might actually refer to all of those things, but that's not a safe starting assumption. You would have to see many examples of a word used like that in order to extend it that broadly, generally speaking. All right, now I want to show you my version of this activity. Here, I have, instead of using ordinary things that you're familiar with, I've tried to put myself in the head of an infant who is unfamiliar both with the language and with the objects in the world. So I'm calling this object here a provender. If you had to make the assumption now, which of these can be called a provender? Would you say this could be called a provender? Could both of these be called a provender? Could all three of these be called a provender? What do you think? What about this one? Let's call this a Craig. What else could be called a Craig? The next time you hear this word, or the next time you see an object, how can you use this word? Can you call this a Craig? These two? All three of these? What about this? If I call this a Rhenus, can this be a Rhenus? What about both of those? Can all three of these be called a Rhenus? What's a Rhenus? I'm going to go back and we're going to talk through these for a second. So here, starting with the provender. This is a tool I don't really understand. I didn't read enough to grasp exactly what it's for, but as you can see, it kind of attaches here to a ruler, and it's used in a similar fashion to drafting, where angles are able to be drawn, and you can kind of use it to draw angled roof lines and things like that. So you can measure, you can slide this up and down the ruler, you can use it to draw angled lines, things like that. So it's similar, I think, in function to a compass or a protractor, something like that. So I've extracted here an image of something that's commonly used today as a protractor or a compass, but it's an uncommon version of that. And here finally we have a drafting table. Now you don't know, in fact I don't know what a provender is. I just made this word up, and I don't know whether this right here being called a provender means that I'm talking about this specific piece of metal, this particular kind, which attaches to a ruler, or if I'm talking about drafting tools more generally, so if I'm referring to these two things, or if I'm saying like anything a drafter might use, including a drafting table, they're all provenders. I didn't decide that when I made this slide. The point here is to understand that when an infant sees a new object, they have to decide what a provender is with very little input. They might see, now they're not seeing this strange object, but everything they see in their life is like this. Everything is curious, everything is unknown. So they see a colorful toy or a new cup or a different type of food, and it's all new and it all has new names. And so they're trying to figure out, what does this name refer to? Is it just this specific thing? Or is it similar types of things? Or is it all different kinds of things? Now, I would say, for me personally, when I hear this word and I look at these objects down here, I think a provender probably can only be applied to this example, probably not to this and this. But if you are like an adult level thinking, then you might extend it more broadly to general tools that a drafter might use or an architect might use. Craig. Here, I personally feel like this object, or sorry, this animal, if I'm calling this a Craig, it probably could only aptly be applied to maybe different ages or very different species of this same similar type of thing. But other spiny fish or other spiny sea-living creatures, probably it's not appropriate to apply this to. I wouldn't assume that we have a word that refers to spiny sea life. So I think it's probably, if I was to assume something here, I would assume that only this could be called a Craig of the three. And if you come here to Rennes, I see these very odd-looking pants here, where the leg of the pant is detached from the body of the pant and just only held in place by these little straps. And I see a second version of that. If I was to see this here in the future, I would definitely feel comfortable calling this a Rennes. But if the sleeves are detached, and maybe not even held on by some kind of special strap, then I might say, I don't know if I could call this a Rennes. Yes, it has some similar features to this, but it's not really close enough for me to feel comfortable calling it that unless I've heard somebody else use the word to apply here as well. And certainly, if I just see some part of the body exposed, and there's maybe some gap between two pieces of clothing, I'm certainly not going to call this outfit a Rennes unless I hear really good examples of other people doing so. Thus, I hope that what I've demonstrated in this illustration is that when you're really encountering truly novel things like an infant might see in their novel, new, naive environment, that you might be biased actually the same way they are to only understanding that word to apply to this subordinate category, that subordinate level of categorization. If you instead feel like these words could be applied to both of these categories, then that might be fair. It might apply to a kind of a basic level categorization. But I think instead what you'll find, if you're really honest with yourself, is that when you're encountering these naive new objects, that you want to apply that new name specifically to that restricted kind of thing. If that's how you feel, you should be able to better empathize with why an infant feels so loath to extrapolate a word beyond how it's being used originally. If they instead see, for instance, a daisy, and later on, and it's called a daisy, or in this case, called a shiff, then later on they might only want to call this flower here a shiff or a daisy or a flower, because they don't know if this appropriately could be called a flower or a daisy or a shift, because they don't know the details yet. They're just guessing in the dark. They're just grappling with unknowns. And the same way that I don't know whether pants separated or shirts separated from the sleeve should be referred to as a Rennes, I feel like if I was an infant, I wouldn't know whether this could be called a flower or a daisy or anything else. I just wouldn't know. And so I hope that this example has given you kind of an indication of how difficult it might be for an infant to map new words onto new objects they've never encountered before, don't understand the function of, don't understand the variability across, and they're just trying to kind of grapple with all this different language. And so it might actually be a very safe and good assumption on their part to underextend these new words to just subordinate level categorizations.